Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Monday, June 27th. We start tonight with Canada's response to the U.S. top court overturning Roe v. Wade. Canadians protested in cities across the country over the weekend to condemn the controversial decision. The law provided the constitutional right to abortion for almost 50 years, and advocates say the decision is worrying and enraging. Jess Legault with the Quebec Federation of Planned Parenthood says she fears the U.S. decision will fuel the rise of pro-life groups and feed into disinformation around the practice in Canada. All right, turning to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's meetings with world leaders at the G7 summit in Germany now. This is where the conflict in Ukraine has been a running theme. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the leaders virtually on Monday. Issues related to Russia's invasion were also central at the Summit of Commonwealth Government Leaders, which wrapped up Sunday in Rwanda. Such topics are expected to drive the agenda when Mr. Trudeau attends the NATO summit in Madrid, Spain. Back at home, Ottawa is bracing for a new round of protests, expected to start on Canada Day, but the city's mayor and police chief say they're ready. Jim Watson and Steve Bell say security plans have been drawn up to allow for safe celebrations on Friday. The capital has seen several large demonstrations since the self-proclaimed Freedom Convoy occupied the downtown core, but police have managed to keep them from taking over the city. Stopping protests on Canada Day will likely be complicated by the presence of thousands of people celebrating the holiday. On the West Coast, Environment Canada says heat warnings will persist in British Columbia and Yukon for at least another day, but cooler conditions are on the way. The Weather Office is maintaining heat warnings for Metro Vancouver, parts of BC's inner South Coast, inland sections of the North Coast, and for Yukon's Dawson region. A heat warning is to continue through Tuesday in Yukon. This is followed by warm weather for the rest of the week. But Environment Canada says heat warnings and special weather statements across most of BC are expected to be replaced by cooler conditions early Tuesday. To the east, Halifax's regional council is to discuss the idea of a federal guaranteed basic income. Global News reports the issue put forward by Councillor Wei Mason will be taken up during the council's meeting tomorrow. Mr. Mason wants a letter sent to the Prime Minister and Premier to request the implementation of a basic income. This to bolster the social safety net. A report released earlier this month found income support would reduce inequality, establish a sense of financial security, and encourage savings. Back in BC, calls to the 911 emergency line had people waiting up to 3 hours for an ambulance on Saturday. This is not including the half-hour wait time to reach a call taker. This is according to a Vancouver dispatcher who said this past Saturday was the worst day they've had this year. She described up to 27 calls to 911 being on hold and not being able to get to them fast enough. And there were only 12 people answering 911 calls province-wide that day. Calls to 911 tend to increase on weekends, particularly during nice weather. Moving to Saskatchewan now, where a woman will lead the province's NDP for the first time in the party's 90-year history. Party members elected Carla Beck at a leadership convention in Regina over the weekend. Ms. Beck has also expressed hope of becoming Saskatchewan's first female premier. But the next provincial election is still more than 2 years away. In her acceptance speech, she vowed to take back Saskatchewan, but didn't propose any new policies. The Queen has traveled to Scotland for a week of events, beginning with a ceremony in Edinburgh Monday morning. The ceremony of the Keys sees the monarch handed the keys to the city and welcomed to her ancient and hereditary Kingdom of Scotland. The visit comes 3 weeks after the Platinum Jubilee, which marked Queen Elizabeth's 70 years on the throne. And Canada's largest Pride celebration returned to Toronto after a 2-year pandemic-induced hiatus. Tens of thousands of people filled the downtown streets and packed the parade route yesterday. This comes despite the shadow of recent anti-LGBTQ violence. Among Sunday's Pride celebrations in downtown Toronto was a march at Nathan Phillips Square in support of abolishing policing and prisons. The event came after the Toronto Police's recent release of race-based policing data, which found Black, Indigenous, and racialized people were overrepresented in use of force incidents and strip searches. Stay with us. When we come back from break, we'll be learning just how effective Canada's mandates and restrictions for COVID-19 were, as well as the country's vaccine campaign throughout the pandemic. We have an interview with Dr. Arthur Slutsky, senior author of a new study, coming up next. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break, only on Forum Daily News. We'll see you soon. A new study suggests Canada outperformed peer countries during the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is thanks to our public health measures and a successful vaccine campaign. The research was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal on Monday. Researchers compared data from 11 countries. The study's co-author says Canada had the highest vaccination rate, the lowest infection rate, and the lowest death rate. Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Arthur Slutsky, scientist at St. Michael's Hospital and senior author of this study. Dr. Slutsky, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks very much for having me, Nima.
So let's start with the main findings from the study and how it was conducted, Doctor.
Well, there's a couple of main findings. The first one is one you've already said, and that's that Canada did very well in terms of overall infections, mortality rate from COVID, and something called excess death rates. So that's the first finding. The second finding is related to the potential mechanisms by which this could occur. And we found that if you looked at the restrictive measures that were had in Canada, they were somewhat greater than other countries, and that Canadians likely, although this didn't come from the data, likely applied the restrictions more than some other countries. But importantly, in terms of vaccination rate, we started a little bit late compared to the United States, for example, but by Canada Day last year, July 1st, 2021, we exceeded the vaccination rate on a per capita basis compared to the United States. We think that that had an impact. And the third thing is the price we paid for all this. There is a price to pay, and then from an economic perspective, we have inflation like much of the rest of the world. We're sort of the middle there. In terms of unemployment, we have unemployment. So we paid a price, and that price is basically to save lives and help the healthcare system.
Well, it sounds like the overall results were positive compared to these other countries. So we mentioned 11 countries were compared in the study. What were these countries? And did Canada outperform all 11 countries?
Yeah, so it was the G10 countries. I won't list all of them, but the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Italy, Japan. So out of those 11 countries, Canada did very well. In terms of mortality, we didn't win compared to all the countries, but we did much better than all countries except for Japan. Japan did much better than us. When we looked at the number of deaths, for example, our deaths were about a third of those per capita of the United States. The next highest country actually had about 30% higher mortality compared to Canada. So we did very well. We were not the best in that regard, but we were in the top two in the G10 countries.
And staying on the topic of mortalities during the COVID-19 pandemic, how did Canada, or rather, if Canada were to follow the trajectory of other countries like the United States in terms of deaths, how many deaths could have Canada had due to COVID-19?
Well, if we had the same mortality rate as the United States, we would have had something like another 60 to 70,000 deaths in Canada till the end of February of this year. I mean, that's a huge number, right? So, when we think about the price we paid, there was a price, but there are a lot of people alive today that wouldn't have been alive if we hadn't taken those steps that we took.
And a huge number indeed. Now, bringing this back to Canadian viewers, how did the response among everyday Canadian citizens during the pandemic compare to those in other peer countries?
Well, we don't have exact data on that. We have restrictions that the government sort of imposed on Canadians and the rest of the other countries. And so we don't have data that said how well did people stick to those restrictions. From my understanding on other data, we did very well compared to the United States. For example, Canadians in general were stuck most closely to the restrictions, much closer than a number of other countries. And that, I think, is important because that had, I think, a major impact early on in the pandemic when there weren't vaccines. So this was a critical factor in keeping our people alive, and mainly the elderly and those disadvantaged. That's where the mortality was the greatest. So it had a a very big impact totally.
All right, Dr. Slutsky, a quick 45 seconds left here, but where is Canada at now in terms of COVID-19 and the pandemic overall?
Well, I think we're in reasonable shape right now. But to be honest, there's a concern. Going forward, if we stay like we are now, I think we'll be fine. But we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know if there's going to be another variant similar to Omicron that might be more deadly coming down at us in the future. So we have to be prepared. I think that the reason this paper was important was it said to Canadians, look, if you follow the restrictions, et cetera, yeah, it hurts, but it has a big impact. And it's possible that in the fall or later on, the government's going to say, based on science, that we have to take some more restrictions. We might have to wear masks more. And quite frankly, that if that's the case, hopefully will save lives.
The United Nations is holding a conference that it hopes will create new momentum for efforts toward an international agreement on protecting the world's oceans. Senior officials and scientists from more than 120 countries are gathering in Lisbon, Portugal for the 5-day event. It's also drawn activists frustrated by the failure to come up with international rules that might ensure ocean sustainability. Oceans cover some 70% of the Earth's surface and provide food and livelihoods for billions of people. Well, joining us now is Dr. Juan Jose Alava, principal investigator at the Ocean Pollution Research Unit at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Alava, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start with comments today by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. So he said egoism on part of some countries has been holding up efforts and agreements to protect the world's oceans. So what does he mean by egoism?
Well, it really tells us that there is an unsustainable use, there is overuse and misuse of ocean marine resources in some areas of the world. One example is the illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing activities that is taking place in some oceans and tropical seas around marine protected areas of the world, which are coming from international nations and they are fishing in international waters. For example, basically harvesting some of the unique resources. Many of them are endemic species. For example, international fishing fleets coming from Asia around the Galapagos Island is one example in which basically we are putting in danger unique marine biodiversity upon which many coastal communities rely on. Another issue is basically the systematic issues at the heart of the societal inequalities and inequities in which some coastal communities have less access to marine resources than other more wealthy nations. So that's very important because the ocean is where most of the people depend on. And here in Canada, for example, the coastal First Nation community are heavily dependent in what the ocean provides to them. An example is the salmon fishery, the herring fishery that need to be taken care of. So it's very important to think about that if we have healthy ocean, we have healthy water and healthy seafood for people. And the point that the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres says that we have an ocean emergency. It's very important to keep in mind because by saving our ocean today, we are protecting our future, the future for future generation. And that's the fundamental concept of sustainability, to leave something for future generation, not just something so that they can enjoy the same resources, marine resources that we are enjoying today. And that's a fundamental thing because there is only one planet, Earth, and there is one big blue planet, and that is our global ocean, right? And in addition to that, we know that the pollution is a huge issue. Ocean plastics pollution is basically affecting many parts. There is not really ocean that is plastic free. So there are this emission coming from many parts of the world, and the irony is that most of the plastic debris, the marine debris, the anthropogenic marine debris, I mean human-made debris, is affecting nations that are not really producing that debris. So this is a problem that needs to be addressed with actions today, with the political will of all the nations to really protect also the most isolated Pacific Island nations, for example, coastal communities, indigenous people that heavily rely on marine resources for subsistence, basically. So that's very important to keep in mind when we are talking about today, according to the recommendation that the UN Secretary just recommended, that we really need to think about in a blue economy and kind of innovate for sustainable oceans. That means that we really need to think about from the point of view of promoting a socially equitable consumption of resources that need to be economically viable and also environmental sustainable. So that's very important so that coastal community minorities and marginalized groups can enjoy also the resources in a fair way. And I think the concept of social equities is a new concept that is coming, is emerging today. We are talking about today social equity and environmental justice in the ocean. And that's important because there are a lot of societal inequalities and because of the lack of equal access to marine resources and the service and ecological function of the ocean. So it's very important that we make sure that coastal nations in the world, everyone have equal access to healthy water, healthy ocean, healthy seafood. So,
Dr. Alavra,
yeah.
Unfortunately, we are nearing the end of this segment, but a lot of important conversations needed to be had at this 5-day summit, so we'll definitely keep an eye on that. Dr. Alavra, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back. The fall of Roe v. Wade has shifted the battleground over abortion in the United States to courthouses around the country. The Supreme Court's decision to end constitutional protections for abortion has opened the gates for a wave of litigation from all sides. Many of the court cases will focus on so-called trigger laws, which have been adopted in 13 states in anticipation of the ruling. Lawsuits could also target old anti-abortion laws that went unenforced under Roe. Moving to the G7 summit in Germany, where leaders from the G7 and 5 other key nations have made pledges around climate change and energy security. In a joint statement, the leaders emphasized the need to accelerate what they call a clean and just energy transition. The statement cites an agreement last year between several rich nations and South Africa that would see the country receive help to end its reliance on coal. Similar partnerships are being discussed with other developing countries. Meanwhile, the head of NATO says the military alliance will increase the size of its rapid reaction forces nearly 8-fold. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the force will grow to about 300,000 troops. This is from its current level of 40,000. Mr. Stoltenberg says it's a response to what he calls an era of strategic competition. He made the remarks at a press conference ahead of a NATO summit in Madrid later this week. The war in Ukraine is going to be a key theme at the upcoming NATO summit. This comes as Ukrainian officials say scores of civilians may be dead or injured after a Russian rocket strike hit a crowded shopping mall. President Volodymyr Zelensky says the number of victims is unimaginable. He cited reports that more than 1,000 civilians were inside at the time. He says the target presented no threat to the Russian army and has no strategic value. Another official in the president's office says at least 2 people are dead and about 20 people were hurt. 9 of them are now in serious condition. More tragedy in southeastern Afghanistan. The United Nations says the death toll of children in last week's devastating earthquake has risen to at least 155. The UN says another 250 children were injured in the magnitude 6 quake, which struck mountainous villages near the border with Pakistan. Afghanistan's Taliban rulers have put the total number of deaths at 1,150. This while the UN has offered a slightly lower estimate of 770. Either way, it was the deadliest earthquake to hit the country in 2 decades. Turning to the UN Ocean Summit, where Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned of egoism among certain countries as an obstacle in ocean sustainability. He says this has been holding up a global agreement on protecting the world's oceans. He said Monday that some countries, which he did not identify, won't accept that the world's oceans belong to everyone. The UN chief was with senior officials and scientists from more than 120 countries. They are attending a 5-day UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, Portugal. Also present were activists frustrated by the failure to come up with international rules that might ensure ocean sustainability. In Norway, a court says the suspect in Saturday's mass shooting during an LGBTQ festival in Oslo has agreed to be held in pre-trial custody for 4 weeks. He will therefore not appear in court. Zaner Matapour is a 42-year-old Norwegian citizen, originally from Iran. He was arrested shortly after the pre-dawn shooting in Oslo's nightlife district, and he was held on suspicion of murder, attempted murder, and terrorism. 2 people were killed and more than 20 were wounded. Norway's prime minister and members of the royal family joined mourners at a memorial service for the victims of the shooting. A 5-year-old girl living in the UK has written a book, and it has been published. This officially makes her the Guinness World Record holder for the world's youngest published author. Bella J. Dark from Weymouth, Dorset, declared last year to her family that she was going to write a book, which is now being published by Ginger Fire Press. And it is available to purchase internationally through Amazon and other retailers. The book, titled The Lost Cat, is the story of a cat that gets lost and eventually realizes that she shouldn't have gone out without her mother. Bella's mother, Chelsea Syme, loves the story's safety message, and she says that she couldn't be more proud. The book is illustrated with Bella's own artwork, except one picture, contributed by her older sister, Lacey May. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You could also watch all our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us, Canada. Take care, and we'll see you next time.